The war dragged on long enough that most people stopped asking who started it. The faction had an answer, of course. The faction always had an answer. And the answer was, the government did it. He named them the Oppressors during a Thursday evening broadcast between a hymn and a commercial break. By Friday morning, 2 million were using the word as if it had always existed. The war started the following Tuesday. That was 18 years ago. The Regional Compliance Authority met in what used to be an S-Mart because every building that once housed a government office had been burned or seized by people angry at the government, which is one of the more reliable features of history. The rebels were out there somewhere in the mountains running on grief and what Aldric chose to call obstinacy, though he privately understood it as something more inconvenient than that. And Yael was gone. Aldric said, "The Continental Fulfillment Center does not belong to the bureaucrats who occupy it. It does not belong to the Allocation Board, the Regional Compliance Authority, or any of the other names they gave themselves this decade to avoid the one word which they were afraid of, which is accountable. The so-called Compliance Authority, that's what they're calling themselves now, the people who want to reach into your home, your church, your broadcast license, and take what God gave you and hand it to someone who did not earn it. They are sitting tonight in a building that used to sell lawn furniture and diapers. They chose it because everything else had been taken from them. I want you to think about that. The people who want to control your life are meeting in the garden center." Then something happened to the air. It arrived first as a point of light on the center monitor, a single dot, pale and steady, the way a star looks when you've been staring too long at the dark. Aldrich saw it and continued. "I want you to think about that." The dot became a line and began moving with the intentional rhythm of something that had a shape it was trying to find. On the monitors behind him, the waveform rose and fell. The feed dropped for 3 seconds. Cameras held their positions, their operators stunned motionless. In the control booth, Delilah saw the waveform on every screen at once, the pattern resolving almost into something she did not want to name. She turned away from the window. Not in fear. The feed came back. Aldric looked into the camera. His expression did not change. "That center belongs to you, the people. And if those sitting in your building tonight will not return what is yours by covenant and by God, then I believe, indeed I know, that God is telling us right now that we are to be the instrument of that return." 2 million people leaned in. "The doors are open," he said. "They always were." They came with flags that the faction made for them, gold and cobalt and official looking at a distance. They carried the words the faction put in their mouths: reclaim, covenant, instrument of God, return to decency. Powerful, sturdy words that spent 18 years in broadcast rotation, which is long enough to turn anyone's belief into scripture. The Continental Fulfillment Center doors were open, as Aldric knew they would be. And by midnight, the Allocation Board had fled through a service exit. The filing division was on fire at 2 a.m. As the sun rose, 14 people were dead. The vending machine had been liberated, and the chyron on everyone's TV read, "Patriots reclaim People's House." That story ran for 6 days. The ratings were extraordinary. 400 miles north, on a street in a city whose name kept changing, the chaos provided cover for something else entirely. The Oppressors never wasted chaos. Neither, if he was being honest, did Aldric. But he didn't know, when he said the doors are open, that Yael was on that street. He knew she was in that city, but he convinced himself these were different things. And he was still telling himself that now. The tower rose from the high desert plateau just north of Flagstaff, a needle of steel and anodized glass that had decided not to apologize for itself, catching the last hard light of the afternoon against a bruise-colored sky. The surrounding terrain was scrub and Martian red rock, and the kind of silence that makes a person aware of their own breathing. The tower did not belong to the landscape. That was the point. 400 feet of broadcast infrastructure, the tallest structure in 300 miles, the tower was lit from below by arrays of gold and cobalt light that made it glow like something consecrated. A red aircraft warning beacon pulsed at the apex with the regularity of a metronome, or a countdown. The tower had no name on its exterior. The faction didn't need to label what everyone already knew was theirs, which was everything in sight, and most things out of it. The 14th floor of the tower housed the broadcast studio, and its designer clearly had strong feelings about ancient Egypt. Strong, specific, and apparently non-negotiable feelings. The walls were midnight blue, trimmed in hammered gold leaf, and inlaid with backlit panels that shifted between amber and deep lapis on a programmed cycle. The anchor desk, Aldric refused to call it anything else, was a single 8-foot slab of polished obsidian streaked with narrow gold veins, cantilevered over the studio floor on a riser so that anyone seated behind it appeared, from the camera's perspective, to be elevated above the world. The cameras, of course, were broadcast grade, mounted on fluid heads, attended by operators who moved with the silent efficiency of acolytes who knew the liturgy by heart and had stopped thinking about what it meant. There were no windows. The outside world entered the studio only when Aldric let it in, framed and interpreted and given the correct meaning before it reached the audience. For 40 years, this had seemed like good editorial practice. Tonight, it felt like something else. Aldric sat behind the obsidian desk with 30 seconds on the clock and the monitors at his back running the rebroadcast of the attack on the fulfillment center as they had every night for 11 days, and he could not remember why he'd agreed with himself. The monitors showed the crowd, and then the doors, and then the chyron. He didn't need to look because he had the footage memorized the way you memorize something you're proud of, a sequence of images that confirm what you already believe about history and your place in it. 2 million people watched him that night. 12 million watched the rebroadcast. The faction's legal team sent a congratulatory fruit basket, which Aldric ate without comment. It wasn't the words. His words were there, stacked in order behind his sternum the way they always were, 40 years of accumulated certainty loaded and ready. He knew the opening, he knew the segue, he knew the 3 points and the closing benediction and the exact cadence when he wanted the audience to feel they had arrived somewhere significant and true. All of it was present and accessible and completely beside the point because what he had lost sometime in the last 90 seconds was the reason any of it mattered. Aldric was 63 years old. He'd been broadcasting for 42 of them, shepherding the faction through a denominational split, more than one federal investigation, and a war that nobody declared and nobody knew how to end. His voice was called a national resource by people who needed to believe that. He was aware, in the way you're aware of a thing you have decided not to examine, that Yael saw the tower growing darker and left before any of this happened. And then she ended up on a street in a city whose name kept changing. 11 days gone now. The monitors were still running, and he had never gone silent at the desk. He was not going to start now. 20 seconds to go. Something entered the room. Not through the doors, both were closed. The studio sealed the way it always was before a live broadcast. The outside world locked out until Aldric decided to let it in. Not through the ventilation or the equipment or the programmed amber to lapis cycle still running normally in his peripheral vision. It entered the way a presence enters, the oldest word for it, the one his tradition had been using for 3,000 years without quite agreeing on what it meant. And it filled the studio the way a room fills when someone who belongs in it walks through the door. Aldric knew this feeling. He had built a career on producing it. He had never experienced it without being the one producing it. He found his hands folded on the obsidian surface in front of him, composed and still, exactly as trained, but they looked like someone else's hands. 15 seconds to go. Through the glass of the control booth, Delilah watched her father's hands. She grew up watching those hands, watching them hold a Bible, hold a microphone, hold an audience of 40,000 people in a stadium, while the cameras found the exact angle that made him look like the only solid thing in a dissolving world. Delilah watched his hands sign the incorporation documents for the faction and determination papers for 17 employees who asked the wrong questions. She knew everything those hands had built and everything they'd refused to touch. Delilah had the broadcast in her bones. 12 seconds to go. She felt it the same moment he did. It was not a sensation she had a category for, which was the problem because Delilah had a category for everything. And she'd spent 11 years producing the language of divine encounter for 2 million people, and she knew every register of it. The goosebump, the catch in the throat, the moment an audience leans forward as one body. And this was none of those things. Those were performance of presence. This was presence itself, filling the booth the way it was filling the studio, moving through the equipment and the glass and through her as if none of it was solid enough to stop it. She recognized it anyway, not the feeling, the source. That was the problem. She turned away from the control booth window and looked at the board. 10 seconds to go. The sound tech had gone still at her station. Headset half lifted from her neck, arrested mid-motion. Camera 2's operator stood with his hand on the fluid head and his own head tilted at an angle that had nothing to do with framing a shot. Nobody spoke. In the booth, in the studio, in the tower that rose 400 feet above the high desert and broadcast the voice of God 6 nights a week to 2 million homes, every person in the room had stopped what they were doing and was doing the same thing instead. Feeling it. Delilah's hand moved to the talkback button, but she didn't press it. She was 18 when Yael first came to the tower, 27 when Yael left it. She spent 9 years watching her father light up in Yael's presence the way he lit up for no one else, not even for her, especially not for her. Yael drew out a brightness in him that Delilah had spent a lifetime trying to earn. Delilah spent 9 years working through what that meant. She tried, for the first 2 of them, to make Yael leave by any means possible. Theological argument, personnel decisions, the kind of character assassination campaign that leaves no fingerprints. None of it worked because Yael was genuinely good, not just at broadcasting, but at believing. You can't argue someone out of a room when they're filling it with light. After nearly a decade, Yael left on her own, and that was worse. Yael saw the tower's shadow and she walked away from it. Then she ended up on that street, and when the news came, Delilah felt something she didn't expect to feel. Did not examine then and would not examine now. What she was going to do instead was get her father on the air. 5 seconds. She pressed the talkback. Dad, her voice in his earpiece, precise and even. We're on in 5. Through the glass, she watched him lift his head. She watched him find the camera the way he always found it, with the ease of a man who had spent decades making eye contact with a lens and meaning it. His shoulders settled, his chin lifted. The practiced stillness of someone about to speak truth descended over him like a garment he'd worn so long he no longer noticed its weight. The light on camera 1 went red. Aldric opened his mouth. The presence was still in the room. He could feel it at 4 feet to his left, the exact distance between his chair and the empty co-host position, the place where someone who knew how to fill a silence had once sat. It did not speak, because it didn't need to. It simply remained, patient as a thing that has been waiting a very long time to be recognized, while the red light held and 2 million people waited, and Aldric made the only choice he knew how to make. He began. And while we do that, I'll put the question for today on the screen, which is, when have you been so certain of what you were about to say that you chose to ignore whether or not it was true?